6. Psychotherapy: How to Cure Modern Suffering. Previously, I discussed Freud and Jung, who focused on the unconscious. While Freud took an individualistic approach to the person's own unconscious developed in their own lifetime, Jung took a more collective approach to the unconscious developed in our lifetime but also inherited from thousands of years of evolutionary wiring. While both Freud and Jung try to explain the unconscious mind, in this segment I'll talk about a few approaches to psychotherapy, or how to solve psychological problems, or how to cure the suffering of the mind. Three distinct approaches emerged in how to cure modern psychological illness. Gestalt psychotherapy took a more masculine approach by emphasizing rationality, therefore putting the responsibility on each individual to grow up and take accountability. In other words, it's better to be cruel than to be kind. Humanistic psychotherapy, on the other hand, took a more softer feminine approach by emphasizing human needs for fulfillment in a lonely and disconnected world. A third approach, called existential psychotherapy, which emerged from literature and storytelling, emphasized life's purpose and meaning as an antidote to modern suffering. Before I explain different schools of psychotherapy, I should give you a brief philosophical context. One of the most fundamental questions that has puzzled philosophers and psychologists has been the problem of perception. How do we know reality? How do we get knowledge of the world? So before we can cure modern suffering, we ought to know what causes this suffering. So perception is at the heart of suffering. For thousands of years, philosophers believed that knowledge is innate in us, most likely given by God or gods. However, in the 17th and 18th centuries, two opposing philosophical approaches emerged in Europe. On the one hand, rationalism argues we have an innate knowledge of the world. It is given to us at birth. The outside world just helps us or triggers us to unfold this innate knowledge. Why innate? Well, it's God-given, or you could say it's in your DNA. The British philosophers such as John Locke and David Hume didn't buy this rationalist explanation. Instead, they argued that our knowledge comes from outside. As babies, we know nothing. As we grow up, we learn things through our senses, and slowly we build a more sophisticated understanding of the world and ourselves. So rationalists think knowledge is innate, and empiricists think knowledge comes from our experiences with the outside world. Then the German philosopher Immanuel Kant came to bring these two schools together. He argued that neither rationalism nor empiricism has the full answer. The real answer is somewhere in the middle. First, Kant argued that we can never fully know the world, so our knowledge is always partial, biased, and limited. Why? Because we are not sponges that absorbs everything. Rather, we are extremely picky and selective in our understanding of the world. Our knowledge of the world comes from outside, but we are not passive. Rather, we are extremely selective in receiving the knowledge. He argued that we humans, in fact, impose our own structure to the world. So our knowledge comes to us organized, categorized, and easy to understand. How do we do it? He said we have an innate mental structure that we impose onto the outside world. However, despite Kant's reconciliation of empiricism and rationalism, science in general favored empiricism, and it was more evidence-based. The empirical approach broke things down into smaller parts so we can analyze them separately. This approach gives science the ability to study matter in its smaller parts like atoms, cells, particles, and so forth. So in Germany in 1880s, when Wundt opened his lab at the University of Leipzig, he was a scientist, and naturally he explained the psyche through empirical experiments. He studied the mind as a structure that can be broken down into smaller parts. Thus, his psychology is termed as a structuralist approach, which is very much an empiricist approach to the human psyche. So structuralism and psychology saw the human mind as a structure that can be broken down into smaller parts, and each part can be studied separately. Wundt, for example, studied humans' reaction to certain triggers and thus divided human consciousness into three parts: representation, willingness, and feeling. The next generation of German-speaking psychologists responded to structuralism by arguing that it is a mistake to look at the mind as a structure. One of the first psychological approaches that questioned structuralism was Gestalt psychology.